In recent months, many North Americans are learning for the first time about the history of Indian boarding schools in both the United States and Canada. Many of us are probably familiar with the story out of Canada from, I believe it was this summer, when the bodies of unknown Indian children were discovered at the site of a Catholic residential school for Native children in Canada. Since then, other schools have been exhumed, and bodies of children have been discovered, and there is a call to do this in the United States as well, and to return children, the remains of Indian children, to the communities to which they belong. For many folks in North America, this is a first introduction to the history of Indian boarding schools. Um, Indian boarding schools were a very specific tool that was created to try to conquer the quote Indian problem in the United States. And I just want to draw your attention. These are headlines from within the past year, from a variety of media sources, popular media sources, but I want to draw your attention to the headline in the middle: Death by Civilization. And in many ways, this is the topic that we're exploring this week, that we're thinking about assimilation, civilization, Americanization, and death, right? Cultural death, actual literal death. And what are the relationships between these ideas, and what are the ways in which schools are implicated in them? So, General Richard Pratt is widely considered the architect of the Indian boarding school system in the United States, and the founder of the Carlisle Industrial School, one of the most notorious, infamous boarding schools in the United States. And General Pratt, who you read about in this unit's readings, you don't read about him, you read a speech that he gave. General Pratt had a philosophical approach to educating Indian children that was essentially this quote for which he is famous: kill the Indian to save the man. The idea being that if Indian people were not assimilated into dominant European American culture, the only other alternative was to actually kill them, as we did for centuries in the United States and Canada, whether through war, through disease, through forced migration, removal from land, and movement west in the Trail of Tears. So, General Pratt, and as you read about his philosophy in his speech this week, you can see that General Pratt and those that supported uh, the schooling of natives through the Indian boarding school system felt that they were making the humanitarian and humane choice. That rather than having to kill, literally, children and communities, that instead we could teach them to assimilate into society, and thus they could stay not as Indians but as Americans. Now, the Indian boarding schools, as the news stories make clear, were often brutal places. If I go backwards, I didn't actually select a good picture for this, but children were often forcibly removed from their homes, reservation and non-reservation homes. Um, some some survivors of boarding schools, and often many alumni of boarding schools refer to themselves as survivors. Survivors of boarding schools talk about being brought to school as a kind of kidnapping, being forcibly taken from their parents, their home community. When they arrived at boarding schools, they were often um, brutally changed, right? Um, their hair was cut off to complete. You can see in this picture here, right? And we know, for example, that hair is important culturally, spiritually. It has significance in many Native cultures, and so that act of hair cutting, of forcing a short hairstyle, was a violent act. Students were beaten for speaking their native languages at boarding schools. Some students ran away regularly and were captured, beaten, brought back to school. Um, we know from the stories about exhuming bodies that life in many boarding schools was brutal enough um, that children died under the care of those who were charged with their education and caretaking. And so, if we come back to General Pratt's idea that this is the more humane option, one wonders, is it really? One doesn't wonder, one sees how survivors of boarding schools describe their experiences. Now, the experience in Indian boarding schools was not monolithic, as we see in the piece on Chiloko Indian School in this week's readings. And so I've intentionally given you 3 readings about Indian boarding schools to put in conversation with one another. One, a speech from General Pratt, who, perfected his plan for the education of Native children when he was in charge of prisoners of war in St. Augustine, Florida. He practiced his instructional methods on Kiowa prisoners in Florida. And then he went on to expand this nationwide to the Indian boarding school system. So we have writing or speaking from Richard Pratt. We have a recent New York Times piece, and the reason I chose this is because it really highlighted the voices of survivors of boarding schools and was written in an accessible way. A lot of the scholarship on boarding schools from historians is written by white historians. And I wanted to make sure that we heard from Native survivors themselves. And so then the third piece that I've given you by Lomoema on Chiloko Indian School presents a really different picture of the experience, right? Of students, adults now, who are Indian boarding school alumni, really talking about their experiences differently than what we're seeing in the media. And that's really important because Lomoema themselves is a Native person, as are all of the people that are interviewed in these oral histories. And so, what does it look like when Native people themselves narrate a history or a story or a telling of their educational experiences in a system that was designed to, if not kill them physically, kill them spiritually? It's in Pratt's words, right? Kill the Indian, save the man. Why the emphasis, though, on Indian boarding schools in this unit on educating a diverse America? So I want to bring us to this question of what is assimilation, because it is a word that comes up in many of our readings in this unit that's thrown around a lot when we talk about immigration policy, when we talk about education, when we talk about diversity. What is assimilation? And I really want to break out 2 different connotations. In the word assimilation, you can see the root word, right? The similarity, right? Becoming similar to others. And in its positive connotations, when we talk about assimilation, we talk about typically immigrants or migrants melting seamlessly into American society, adopting English as their language, adopting a Protestant work ethic, and adopting belief in the American dream, right? So assimilation is about becoming part of American culture and society, and that these are 3 of the tenets of that. You speak English, you work hard, right? And you're willing to sacrifice yourself in order to work hard, and you believe that the American dream is possible, that if you work hard, you will see success. And ultimately, in this discourse of assimilation, it's the idea that migrants and immigrants will come to see themselves as Americans first, that they will shed their prior identities as Chinese or French or Haitian or Guatemalan or Canadian or whatever the case may be, that they will shed that to see themselves as American first. There is a more critical connotation of assimilation, however, that if, again, thinking about just immigrants and migrants, and we'll expand out in a moment, but thinking about immigrants and migrants, it's the idea that melting seamlessly into American society requires the erasure of one's heritage language and one's identity prior to becoming American. That one is expected to give up who they are in order to become something else, to become American. There is the sense that assimilation, ultimately, in asking immigrants and migrants to adopt English, Protestant work ethic, American dream, yada yada, that's asking immigrants and migrants to strive towards the norms of whiteness. However, never making clear that whiteness will forever remain out of reach because most immigrants and migrants are not white. Now, you don't have to be white to enact whiteness. Whiteness is a set of behaviors, beliefs, actions that embody a white social positioning. What the theorist Sylvia Wynter talks about as conceptual whiteness and conceptual blackness, a binary positioning of power in society. By making whiteness the standard for assimilation, one of the critiques of assimilation is it sets up those who are not white, those who are immigrants and who are migrants and who are people of color and indigenous people, if they are striving for assimilation and striving towards a standard of whiteness, it will forever remain unobtainable. And thus assimilation becomes a tool of white supremacy. That assimilation becomes a way of saying we will accept you if you do these things, and these things involve losing who you are, but that promise is never fully realized because you are always on the outskirts of society because you will never actually be in the dominant group. So these are two, you can see that both of these ideas of assimilation or understandings of what it involves are rooted in the same dictionary definition, right? Of becoming similar, of becoming one with a community, of blending into a community. But they have very different understandings and connotations. And so in this unit, as we're thinking about educating a diverse America, we're really ultimately thinking about assimilation. And what is the role of schools in assimilating? And is it ever possible to assimilate without that assimilation being an act of violence? Okay, let's talk about why we're talking about assimilation and why we're talking about a diverse America right now. So just to remind us, to give a bit of historical background, the 1800s brought about significant changes to American identity and the population. And I would raise the question of what do these changes mean for considering how to educate a diverse student population. The 1800s, we see massive immigration from Europe, and we also see waves of immigration from Asia as well to the West Coast specifically, right? So we have, when I say immigration from Europe, right, we think specifically about specific ethnic and national groups moving to the United States, not all of whom were welcomed, right? Italians and Irish, as many are want to explain, were not initially considered white. They were not initially considered to be acceptable. So they represented a diversifying American identity. At this time, we also have, in the 1800s, we have the Civil War. We have the Emancipation Proclamation. We have a brief period of Reconstruction, and we have the beginning of Jim Crow. And so all of these also bring into focus that America is wrestling with how to incorporate or not incorporate freed Black Americans into the American identity. We also have in 1848 the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ended the Mexican-American War. The United States annexed large swaths of Mexico, of northern Mexico at the time. And Mexican citizens were now American citizens. And the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo made many guarantees, one of which was that Mexican citizens who were now American citizens had the right to continue using their language, including in education. We also have in the 1800s the Indian Removal Act, the Trail of Tears, the move to get the remaining indigenous people off of land so that European settlers could continue moving west, can continue growing, and claiming land in North America. And so all of these changes to the American population, or if not changes, as in the case of Black Americans, changes in the status of these groups and individuals in the US population, raised a question of what to do, right? What those in power in the United States at the time, what are we to do with this diversifying populace? Do we kill them? That was tried, certainly, specifically in relation to Native peoples in North America, right? Also in terms of the Mexican-American War. Do we remove them? Do we simply we don't kill them, but we get them out so they are no longer a part of our society? This was certainly tried, Indian Removal Act. Also in terms of treatment of enslaved Africans and African Americans, and later in terms of segregation and Jim Crow. You live here, but you will not be of here. You will be in a separate world. We can also then, another option is to assimilate. Do we recognize that we are diversifying and allow diverse peoples access to becoming a part of our society if they engage in certain behaviors? Indian boarding schools would be an example of this. And a fourth option would be, do we include? Do we simply accept that there are diverse peoples and communities that make up our society and accept them as they are? And an example of that might be, for example, in Wisconsin with German immigrants who attended bilingual schools for decades, right? They were typically Lutheran and Catholic schools that were taught in German, and German immigrants were, while it was not seamless by any stretch of the imagination, there was an extent to which German immigrants in Wisconsin and in Milwaukee specifically were allowed to simply be German. So these are some of the changes that we see to American identity. And that this all plays out in schooling as well. I'm not going to go through all of these dates, but I just want to point out a couple of them to show you that in the 1800s and then moving into the 20th century, we see schools wrestling with this question of, how do we handle diverse students in our schools? Do we remove them via segregation, Indian boarding schools? Do we assimilate them? The first compulsory education law in Massachusetts was, while it was targeting poor children, it was to assimilate or civilize poor children into middle class and upper class culture. If we are assimilating, does that mean that schools should, for example, teach freed Blacks in the South how to participate in white society? So assimilation, or should it be removal? You have your own segregated schools, do your thing. And then we have inclusion. Who gets included if we fully accept who our diverse students are, and what might that look like? And we have struggles for that over time. In 1885, there was a court case, Tate versus Hurley, that argued that the exclusion of Chinese Americans from California's public schools was illegal. It was an attempt to be included, right? Same with Lum versus Rice in 1927, and ultimately in Brown v. Board in 1954. So we see schools mirroring this struggle over what to do with diversity. And again, diversity is only posed as a problem because those in power often over time, if we go back to these different groups, were engaged in explicit oppression of people who were not from a Northern European white colonial settler heritage. We also specifically see all of this playing out in relation to bilingual policy in schools and in education. That while, if you were to come back to this slide and look at all of these different dates and different ways in which schools were wrestling with removal, assimilation, or inclusion, specifically it plays out even more obviously in relation to bilingual education policy. The Ovando reading for this week is an excellent and very detailed and very dense accounting of bilingual education policy and how it has shifted over time. It's a piece that you may find you want to revisit again in the future. You're not going to get every detail the first time you read it. It's really an excellent and painstaking history of bilingual educational policy. But we can see that bilingual education policy, we often think of it as something that is new, but it is not. Right? Bilingual educational policy, official policies, began in the 1800s. Ohio was the first state in 1839 to pass bilingual education laws for German and English instruction. Louisiana did the same shortly thereafter for French and English, and New Mexico for Spanish and English. Bilingual education has been in place since at least officially the 1830s, right? At the same time, or a few decades later, the federal government outlaws education in native Indian languages. So we see a tension between whose language gets included and allowed in these spaces and whose gets outlawed. The case of the Bennett Law in Wisconsin is really interesting because it was briefly a law that was passed to outlaw bilingual education that was quickly overturned in the next election. If you continue in this timeline, though, and you look towards the end, you will see, for example, Prop 227, Prop 203, and Arizona Bill HB 2281, all of which are anti-bilingual, anti-ethnic studies, anti-immigrant legislation. So let's talk about the Bennett Law really briefly. So this was enacted in 1889. You get to look at a quick summary of it from the Encyclopedia of Milwaukee in this unit's readings, and it was repealed in 1890. And the idea behind the Bennett Law was that we needed to better Americanize our immigrant, or one of the ideas was that we needed to better Americanize the immigrant population in Wisconsin. And so the Bennett Law mandated, I believe it was between 12 and 24 weeks of public instruction, and for, I don't remember the age range, but it was public instruction for, I believe, elementary and young adolescents, and that those 12 to 24 weeks had to be in English. Now, remember at this time, for example, in Milwaukee, many immigrants, specifically German immigrants, but other languages as well, other ethnic and immigrant groups, attended bilingual schools. This law attempted to regulate not only public schools, but also parochial and private schools as well, saying these 12 to 24 required weeks must be in English. It was widely criticized as a nativist attempt to control and regulate the immigrant communities of Milwaukee specifically. And in 1890, the law was repealed. It was briefly in place, and it was quickly repealed. But it highlights what is at stake in the discourse around education, diversity, language, and assimilation. Now, for those of you familiar with Gloria Anzaldúa, you'll recognize this quote. She is a Borderlands writer, a mestiza writer, who says that wild tongues cannot be tamed, they can only be cut out. And so we can look at the Bennett Law. We can look at bilingual education policy. We can look at other changes to American identity and schooling, none of which are explicitly and overtly violent. In fact, they are about ideologically, instructionally, how do we address diversity? How do we include it? How do we not include it? How do we exclude? How do we define who is American? But Gloria Anzaldúa reminds us that all of those discourses and practices are violent. Because wild tongues cannot be tamed, they can only be cut out. Our language, if we look specifically just at bilingual education, language is so fundamental to who we are as people and how we make sense of the world, that to mandate the exclusion of someone's language or the loss of their language becomes an act of violence. Is it also an opportunity? Yes, absolutely, right? There is a reason. I don't want to say it that way. We cannot discount the fact that many immigrant communities value and prioritize the learning of English. But as the children of immigrants and grandchildren of immigrants often say in-depth social science research, they feel a sense of loss, that they don't speak a language or that they were forcibly denied their language. And so it raises this broader question of, is assimilation always a violent act? Even when it's not explicitly violent, is it a form of violence? And different people will answer this question in different ways. But I do want to distinguish between three ideas that may help you think about this in relation to schooling. There is assimilation, which we went over briefly at the beginning of this lecture. In the context of Indian boarding schools, assimilation specifically was an act of cultural genocide. It was intended to kill off Indian native cultures, spirituality, and languages. This was repeated again in the urbanization movements of American Indians in the mid 20th century, but that it was very explicitly about ending a culture. That is why Pratt uses the language of kill the Indian, save the man. Americanization is very specifically about assimilation into an American ideal, right? It's often associated with nativist ideas. It is associated with a belief that diversity cannot exist in America, that in order for diverse peoples to live in America, they have to be Americanized, assimilated into a particular norm. So as we think about these three terms, they can help us wrestle with this question of, is assimilation a violent act? And the readings this week are going to present, or in this unit, I should say, are going to present different ideas about this. Different perspectives about assimilation, whether it's positive, whether it's negative, whether it's violent, whether it's not. And that will help you think overall about the big question for this unit of, what does it mean to educate diverse students in a democracy? What is the ethical and appropriate way to educate diverse students in a democracy? We cannot answer that question pedagogically in the scope of a history of education class, but we can look at how we have wrestled with that question over time and with different ethnic groups.